The opulent ballroom of the Hawthorne estate glittered with crystal chandeliers and the sparkling jewels of New York's elite. Amidst the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, Sarah Thompson stood out like a sore thumb in her simple black uniform. The 25-year-old maid clutched a silver tray of champagne flutes, her hands trembling slightly as she navigated the crowd of Manhattan's most influential socialites. Sarah's emerald eyes darted nervously around the room, searching for a familiar face. She found none. Instead, she caught snippets of conversation about stock portfolios, yacht clubs, and summer homes in the Hamptons. It was a world so far removed from her own that she might as well have been on another planet. As she weaved through the throng of guests, Sarah's mind wandered to the events that had led her here. Just 6 months ago, she had been working 2 jobs to support her ailing mother and pay for her younger brother's college tuition. Then, like a miracle, she had landed this position at the Hawthorne estate. The pay was better than she could have ever dreamed, and it came with a small apartment on the grounds. For the first time in years, Sarah had dared to hope for a brighter future. But that hope was about to be shattered in the cruelest of ways. Well, a silky voice purred behind her. If it isn't our little Cinderella, playing dress-up at the ball. Sarah turned to face Vivian Hawthorne, the lady of the house. The statuesque blonde towered over her in 6-inch Louboutins, her crimson lips curved into a predatory smile. Vivian's steel-gray eyes raked over Sarah's form, taking in every imperfection with barely concealed disdain. I was just serving the champagne, Mrs. Hawthorne, Sarah stammered, feeling her cheeks flush with embarrassment. Vivian plucked a flute from Sarah's tray and took a delicate sip. "Oh, darling," she drawled, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "you're doing a marvelous job. Why, I almost didn't recognize you without a mop in your hand." A titter of laughter rippled through the nearby guests, and Sarah felt her stomach clench with humiliation. She wanted nothing more than to disappear, to melt into the polished marble floor beneath her feet. But she couldn't. She needed this job. "Thank you, Mrs. Hawthorne," Sarah managed to say, forcing a smile onto her face. "Is there anything else I can do for you?" Vivian's eyes glinted with malice. "Actually, there is," she said, her voice rising to carry across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?" The chatter in the ballroom died down as all eyes turned to Vivian. Sarah felt her heart begin to race, a sense of foreboding washing over her. "As you know, we're here tonight to celebrate the launch of Hawthorne Industries' new charitable foundation," Vivian announced, her voice ringing with false philanthropy. "And what better way to demonstrate our commitment to lifting up the less fortunate than by shining a spotlight on one of our own staff members?" Sarah's eyes widened in horror as Vivian wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. The champagne tray trembled in her grip, threatening to spill its contents onto the immaculate floor. "This is Sarah," Vivian continued, her smile never reaching her eyes. "She's been with us for, how long is it now, dear?" 6 months, Mrs. Hawthorne," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. 6 whole months! Vivian exclaimed, as if this were a remarkable achievement. "And in that time, Sarah has shown us all what it truly means to be humble." The way Vivian emphasized the word humble made it sound like an insult. Sarah felt her cheeks burn hotter, aware of the hundreds of eyes now fixed upon her. "You see, before coming to work for us, Sarah here was practically destitute," Vivian went on, her voice filled with mock sympathy. "Living in a tiny apartment in the Bronx, working 2 minimum wage jobs just to make ends meet. It's a story we've all heard before, isn't it? The struggling single mother, sacrificing everything for her family?" Sarah's head snapped up at this. She wasn't a mother. She had never been married. What was Mrs. Hawthorne talking about? But before she could correct the mistake, Vivian barreled on. And of course, there's the deadbeat father, who ran off and left poor Sarah to raise their child alone. It's just heartbreaking, isn't it? The room filled with murmurs of sympathy and disapproval. Sarah stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. This wasn't her story. These weren't her struggles. But as she opened her mouth to protest, Vivian's grip on her shoulder tightened painfully. "But our Sarah here, she doesn't let any of that get her down," Vivian continued, her voice syrupy sweet. "No, she comes to work every day with a smile on her face, ready to scrub our floors and wash our laundry. It's truly inspiring." Sarah felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to run, to hide, to wake up from this nightmare. But she was trapped in Vivian's iron grip, forced to endure the pitying looks and whispered comments of the guests. "In fact," Vivian said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial stage whisper, "Sarah is so dedicated to her work that she's even willing to go above and beyond the call of duty. Isn't that right, dear?" Sarah's blood ran cold. She had no idea what Vivian was implying, but she knew it couldn't be good. I don't understand, Mrs. Hawthorne," she managed to choke out. Vivian's smile turned predatory. "Oh, come now, Sarah. There's no need to be shy. We all know about your little arrangement with Mr. Hawthorne." The room fell silent. Sarah felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her feet. She looked around wildly, searching for Mr. Hawthorne, but he was nowhere to be seen. "What arrangement?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vivian's eyes glittered with malice. "The late-night meetings in his study," she said, making air quotes with her perfectly manicured fingers. "The extra money that mysteriously appears in your paycheck. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" Sarah's mind reeled. There had been no late-night meetings, no extra money. She had never even been alone in a room with Mr. Hawthorne. But as she looked around at the sea of judgmental faces, she realized that none of that mattered. They had already decided she was guilty. "Mrs. Hawthorne, please," Sarah begged, her voice cracking. "There's been a mistake. I've never dash." "Save your excuses," Vivian snapped, her facade of sweetness evaporating. "I won't stand here and be made a fool of in my own home. You're fired, effective immediately. I want you off my property within the hour." With that, Vivian released her grip on Sarah's shoulder and turned away, leaving her standing alone in the center of the ballroom. The champagne tray slipped from Sarah's numb fingers, shattering on the marble floor in a cacophony of breaking glass and spilled alcohol. The sound seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the room. Suddenly, everyone was talking at once, their voices a mixture of shock, scandal, and salacious gossip. Sarah stood amidst the broken glass and spilled champagne, her world crumbling around her. How had this happened? How had her life fallen apart so completely in the span of a few minutes? As she stumbled towards the exit, her vision blurred by unshed tears, Sarah caught snippets of conversation that made her stomach churn. "I always knew there was something off about that girl. Poor Vivian, having to deal with such a homewrecker. I heard she's not even from New York. Probably some gold digger from the Midwest." Sarah burst through the heavy oak doors of the ballroom and into the cool night air. She gasped, gulping in deep breaths as she tried to steady herself. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare. Any moment now, she would wake up in her little apartment on the estate grounds, ready to start another day of honest work. But as the cruel laughter and judgmental whispers floated out from the ballroom, Sarah knew this was all too real. She had just lost everything, her job, her home, her reputation, all because of a lie. As she stumbled down the gravel driveway, her uniform soaked with spilled champagne, Sarah's mind raced. Where would she go? How would she support her family now? And most importantly, How could she clear her name? Little did Sarah know, her journey was just beginning. For as she left the Hawthorne estate behind, fate was already setting in motion a chain of events that would not only vindicate her but shake the very foundations of New York's high society. In the shadows of the estate's manicured gardens, a figure watched Sarah's retreating form with interest. Thomas Green, the Hawthorne's groundskeeper, had witnessed the entire spectacle through the ballroom windows. His weathered face creased with concern as he watched the young maid disappear into the night. Thomas had always liked Sarah. She was a hard worker, kind to everyone regardless of their station, and never complained even when given the most unpleasant tasks. He had seen the way Mr. Hawthorne looked at her, with a mixture of guilt and longing that made Thomas uneasy. But he had also seen Sarah rebuff the man's advances time and time again, always maintaining a polite but firm professionalism. Now, as he replayed Vivian's accusations in his mind, Thomas felt a surge of anger. He knew the truth about the Hawthornes, about the secrets that lurked behind the facade of their perfect life. And he knew that Sarah was nothing more than a convenient scapegoat for their own failings. With a determined set to his jaw, Thomas stepped out of the shadows and headed towards his small cottage on the edge of the estate. He had some phone calls to make. It was time the truth came to light, no matter the cost. As Sarah walked along the dark, empty streets of the affluent neighborhood, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, humiliation, and fear battled for dominance, each threatening to overwhelm her. The cool night air raised goosebumps on her skin, her thin uniform offering little protection against the chill. She had no idea where she was going. Her phone, her wallet, even her coat, everything was still in her room at the estate. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of despair. As she rounded a corner, the skies opened up, and rain began to pour down in heavy sheets. Sarah let out a bitter laugh, tilting her face up to the heavens. Of course it would rain. Why not add insult to injury? She stumbled on, her shoes squelching with each step, her hair plastered to her face. The tears she had been holding back finally broke free, mixing with the raindrops on her cheeks. How had her life come to this? As she walked, Sarah's mind drifted back to her family. Her mother, battling cancer in a small apartment in Queens. Her younger brother, working part-time jobs to pay for community college. They were counting on her. How could she face them now? Lost in her thoughts, Sarah didn't notice the sleek black car pulling up beside her until a voice called out, cutting through the sound of the rain. Sarah? Sarah Thompson? She turned, squinting through the downpour. The rear window of the car was rolling down, revealing a face she recognized from countless magazine covers and news reports. Mr. Callahan? She gasped, hardly believing her eyes. Alexander Callahan, CEO of one of New York's largest media conglomerates, leaned out of the window, concern etched on his distinguished features. Good God, child, what are you doing out here in this weather? And in your uniform, no less? Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could she explain the humiliation she had just endured? How could she tell this titan of industry that she had been falsely accused and cast out like garbage? Mr. Callahan's eyes softened as he took in her bedraggled appearance. Never mind, explanations can wait. Get in the car before you catch your death. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. She had already trusted the wealthy and powerful once, and look where that had gotten her. But as another gust of wind cut through her sodden uniform, she realized she had little choice. With trembling hands, she opened the car door and slid into the warm, leather-scented interior. As soon as she was inside, Mr. Callahan shrugged off his expensive suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. James, he called to the driver, take us home. As the car pulled away from the curb, Sarah huddled into the jacket, its warmth and weight providing a small measure of comfort. She snuck a glance at Mr. Callahan, who was watching her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Now then," he said gently, "why don't you tell me what's happened?" And so, as the car wound its way through the rainy streets of New York, Sarah poured out her story. She told him about her job at the Hawthorne estate, about the cruel accusations Vivian had leveled against her, about losing everything in the span of a few terrible minutes. Mr. Callahan listened intently, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. When Sarah finally fell silent, he reached out and patted her hand gently. "My dear," he said, his voice filled with righteous indignation, "what's been done to you is unconscionable. But I want you to know that this is not the end. Far from it." Sarah looked up at him, a tiny spark of hope flickering in her chest. "What do you mean?" Mr. Callahan's eyes glinted with determination. "I mean, Miss Thompson, that we're going to set things right. The Hawthorns may think they're above the law, but they're about to learn a very harsh lesson." As the car pulled up to a magnificent townhouse on the Upper East Side, Sarah felt a strange mix of exhaustion and anticipation. She had no idea what Mr. Callahan had in mind, but for the first time since leaving the Hawthorne estate, she felt a glimmer of hope. Little did she know, her encounter with Alexander Callahan was just the beginning. The events set in motion that rainy night would not only change her life forever but would send shockwaves through the very heart of New York's elite society. As Sarah stepped out of the car and into the shelter of Mr. Callahan's home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the precipice of something monumental. The humble maid from the Bronx was about to embark on a journey that would test her strength, challenge her beliefs, and ultimately reveal truths that would leave everyone speechless. But for now, as she followed Mr. Callahan into the warmth of his home, all Sarah could think about was getting dry, getting warm, and figuring out how to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. The storm outside raged on, a fitting backdrop to the tumult in her heart. Yet somewhere in the distance, barely perceptible, a break in the clouds promised the faintest glimmer of dawn. The Callahan townhouse was a stark contrast to the opulent excess of the Hawthorne estate. While undeniably luxurious, it exuded a warmth and lived-in comfort that immediately put Sarah at ease. As they entered the foyer, a motherly woman in her late 50s hurried to meet them. "Oh, you poor dear," she exclaimed, taking in Sarah's bedraggled appearance. "Alexander, who is this?" Mr. Callahan placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Margaret, this is Sarah Thompson. She's had a rather terrible night, I'm afraid." "Sarah, this is my wife, Margaret." Margaret's kind eyes filled with concern. "Well, we can't have you standing around in those wet clothes. Come with me, dear. We'll get you sorted out in no time." With a motherly arm around Sarah's shoulders, Margaret guided her up the grand staircase. Sarah couldn't help but marvel at the warmth and genuine concern these strangers were showing her. It was a far cry from the cold cruelty she had experienced at the Hawthorne estate. As they entered a spacious guest room, Margaret bustled about, pulling out fluffy towels and a set of comfortable pajamas. "These should fit you well enough for now," she said, handing the items to Sarah. "There's an ensuite bathroom just through that door. Take a hot shower and change into these. I'll have some tea ready for you when you come down." Sarah stood there, overwhelmed by the kindness. I don't know how to thank you," she stammered. Margaret's eyes softened. "Oh, hush now. There's no need for thanks. We help those in need, it's as simple as that. Now, go on and get yourself warmed up. We'll talk more once you're comfortable." As the bathroom door closed behind her, Sarah let out a shaky breath. The events of the night came crashing down on her once more, and she felt her knees buckle. She sank to the floor, her back against the door, and allowed herself a moment to cry. The hot tears mixed with the rainwater still clinging to her face, washing away some of the pain and humiliation of the past few hours. After a few minutes, Sarah pulled herself together. She couldn't wallow in self-pity, not when these kind people were going out of their way to help her. She stripped off her soaked uniform and stepped into the shower, letting the hot water soothe her aching muscles and troubled mind. As she dried off and changed into the soft pajamas Margaret had provided, Sarah caught sight of herself in the mirror. Her green eyes, usually bright and full of life, looked dull and haunted. But beneath the pain and exhaustion, there was a glimmer of something else. Determination. She may have been knocked down, but Sarah Thompson was not one to stay down for long. Downstairs, she found Mr. and Mrs. Callahan waiting for her in a cozy study. A crackling fire in the hearth cast a warm glow over the room, and the scent of chamomile tea wafted through the air. Margaret patted the seat next to her on a plush sofa, and Sarah sank into it gratefully. "Now then," Mr. Callahan said, leaning forward in his armchair, "why don't you tell us the whole story from the beginning?" And so, cradling a warm cup of tea in her hands, Sarah recounted the events of the evening. She told them about her job at the Hawthorne estate, about Vivian's cruel public humiliation, and about the false accusations that had cost her everything. As she spoke, she saw the Callahans exchange knowing glances, their expressions growing darker with each passing moment. When she finished, silence fell over the room. Mr. Callahan stood and paced in front of the fireplace, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he turned to Sarah, his eyes blazing with determination. "Sarah," he said, his voice firm but kind, "what happened to you tonight was not just cruel, it was illegal. Vivian Hawthorne's actions constitute slander and wrongful termination. We can fight this." Sarah's eyes widened. "Fight it? But how?" "They're the Hawthornes. They're one of the most powerful families in New York. Who would believe me over them?" Mr. Callahan's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "My dear, you forget who you're talking to. I may not flaunt my influence like the Hawthornes do, but I assure you, I have considerable sway in this city. More importantly, I have something the Hawthornes lack: integrity." Margaret reached out and squeezed Sarah's hand. "What my husband is trying to say, dear, is that we believe you. And we're going to help you clear your name." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. The kindness of these virtual strangers was almost too much to bear. "But why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do all this for me?" Mr. Callahan's expression softened. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because, if I'm being honest, I've been looking for a way to take the Hawthornes down a peg or two for years. They've hurt a lot of people with their arrogance and greed. It's high time someone stood up to them." As Sarah processed this information, a knock at the study door interrupted their conversation. A moment later, a young man in his early 30s entered the room. He had Mr. Callahan's strong jawline and Margaret's kind eyes, and Sarah immediately knew this must be their son. "Mom, Dad, I came as soon as I got your message." "What's the emergency?" He stopped short when he saw Sarah, his eyes widening slightly. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize we had company." Mr. Callahan gestured for his son to join them. "Sarah, this is our son, Ethan. He's a lawyer with the district attorney's office. Ethan, this is Sarah Thompson. She's going to need our help." Ethan's eyebrows rose as he took in Sarah's appearance and the serious expressions on his parents' faces. "It's nice to meet you, Sarah," he said, his voice warm and professional. "Dad, what's going on?" As Mr. Callahan filled Ethan in on the situation, Sarah couldn't help but study the young man. He listened intently, his brow furrowing in concentration. Occasionally, he would interject with a question, his mind clearly working through the legal implications of her story. When Mr. Callahan finished speaking, Ethan turned to Sarah, his expression serious. "Ms. Thompson, what happened to you is completely unacceptable. If you're willing, I'd like to take on your case personally. We can file charges against the Hawthorns for slander, wrongful termination, and possibly even harassment. Sarah felt a flicker of hope in her chest, but it was quickly doused by reality. But I don't have any money for lawyers, she said, her voice small. I can barely afford to feed my family as it is. Ethan shook his head, a determined glint in his eye. Don't worry about that. I'll take this case pro bono. What the Hawthorns did to you was wrong, and they need to be held accountable. As Sarah looked around at the Callahan family, Alexander's determined expression, Margaret's motherly concern, and Ethan's passionate commitment to justice, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Okay, she said, squaring her shoulders. If you really think we have a chance, I'm willing to fight. Mr. Callahan clapped his hands together. Excellent! Now, the first thing we need to do is gather evidence. Sarah, do you know of anyone at the Hawthorn estate who might be willing to speak on your behalf? Sarah's mind immediately went to Thomas, the kindly groundskeeper who had always treated her with respect. There's Thomas Green, the groundskeeper. He's been there for years, and he's always been kind to me. I think he might have seen some things. Ethan nodded, jotting down notes on a legal pad. Good, that's a start. We'll need to interview him discreetly. Dad, can you use your connections to get us access to the Hawthorns' financial records? I have a hunch there might be some discrepancies that could help our case. As the Callahans began to formulate their plan of attack, Sarah felt a mix of emotions swirling in her chest. Fear of what lay ahead, gratitude for these unexpected allies, and beneath it all, a burning desire for justice. The Hawthorns had tried to destroy her, but they had no idea what they had set in motion. Little did any of them know, across town at the Hawthorn estate, events were unfolding that would turn their world upside down. Back at the Hawthorn mansion, the party was winding down. The last of the guests were stumbling out into waiting limousines, their heads buzzing with champagne and scandalous gossip. Vivian Hawthorn stood in the foyer, a fake smile plastered on her face as she bid farewell to New York's elite. As soon as the massive oak doors closed behind the final guest, Vivian's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. She stormed through the house, her stilettos clicking angrily on the marble floors, until she reached her husband's study. Without knocking, she burst into the room. Richard! Where the hell have you been all night? Richard Hawthorn looked up from his desk, his expression weary. He was a handsome man in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes that were now clouded with exhaustion and something that looked suspiciously like guilt. I've been working, Vivian. You know how important this deal is. Vivian's eyes narrowed dangerously. Working? While I'm out there cleaning up your mess? Do you have any idea what I had to do tonight? Richard's brow furrowed in confusion. What are you talking about? What mess? Don't play dumb with me, Richard, Vivian hissed, leaning over the desk. I know all about your little dalliance with that maid. Sarah, was it? Did you really think I wouldn't find out? The color drained from Richard's face. Vivian, I don't know what you think you know, but I assure you dash. Save it! Vivian snapped, cutting him off. I took care of it. I fired the little tramp and made sure everyone at the party knows what kind of woman she really is. Your reputation is safe, for now. Richard stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward. You did what? Vivian, how could you? Sarah is innocent. She's never dash. Never what, Richard? Vivian's voice was dangerously soft. Never succumb to your charms? Never let you seduce her like all the others? Please. I wasn't born yesterday. Richard ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. Vivian, you've made a terrible mistake. Sarah has done nothing wrong. We need to fix this, to bring her back and apologize. Vivian let out a harsh laugh. Bring her back? Apologize? Have you lost your mind? It's done, Richard. She's gone, her reputation is in tatters, and if you know what's good for you, you'll never mention her name again. With that, Vivian turned on her heel and stormed out of the study, leaving Richard standing there, his world crumbling around him. He sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. How had things gone so wrong? As the weight of the situation settled on him, Richard made a decision. He couldn't let an innocent young woman suffer for his mistakes. He had to make this right, no matter the cost. Little did he know, his decision was about to set off a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of New York society. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the tumultuous events of the previous night. Sarah woke up disoriented, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings of the Callahans' guest room. As the memories of the previous night came flooding back, she felt a fresh wave of anxiety wash over her. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Sarah? Are you awake, dear?" Margaret's gentle voice called out. "Yes, Mrs. Callahan." "I'll be right out," Sarah replied, quickly running a brush through her tangled hair and straightening the borrowed pajamas. When she opened the door, she found Margaret waiting with a warm smile and a neatly folded stack of clothes. "I hope these fit," she said, handing the clothes to Sarah. "They're some of my daughter's old things. She's about your size." Sarah accepted the clothes gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Callahan, for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for your kindness." Margaret waved away her thanks. "Nonsense, dear. Now, get dressed and come down for breakfast. We have a busy day ahead of us." 30 minutes later, Sarah found herself seated at the Callahans' dining table, surrounded by a spread that would have put the Hawthorne chef to shame. As she sipped her coffee, she listened to Mr. Callahan and Ethan discuss their plan of action. "I've arranged a meeting with Thomas Green this afternoon," Mr. Callahan was saying. "He's agreed to meet us at a cafe near the estate. Sarah, do you feel up to joining us?" Sarah nodded, determination setting in. "Yes, I want to be there. Thomas has always been kind to me. I think he'll tell the truth about what happened." Ethan leaned forward, his expression serious. "Sarah, I need to prepare you. This fight isn't going to be easy. The Hawthorns have a lot of power and influence. They're not going to take this lying down." "I understand," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "But I can't let them get away with what they did. Not just to me, but to who knows how many others before me." Mr. Callahan nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit, my dear. Now, Ethan, what's our next move after we speak with Mr. Green?" As Ethan outlined their legal strategy, Sarah found herself marveling at the turn her life had taken. Just 24 hours ago, she had been a simple maid, invisible to the world of power and privilege that surrounded her. Now, she was at the center of what promised to be one of the biggest scandals to rock New York's elite in years. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of phone calls, legal documents, and strategy sessions. By the time they were ready to leave for their meeting with Thomas, Sarah felt as though she had aged years in just a few short hours. As they pulled up to the small cafe where they were set to meet Thomas, Sarah's stomach was in knots. What if he refused to help? What if Vivian had already gotten to him? Her fears were put to rest the moment she saw Thomas's weathered face. The old groundskeeper's eyes lit up when he saw her, and he enveloped her in a warm hug. "Sarah, my dear girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry about what happened. It isn't right, what they did to you. As they settled into a quiet booth at the back of the cafe, Thomas turned to Mr. Callahan and Ethan, his expression grave. "I suppose you gentlemen want to know what I saw and heard at the Hawthorne estate." Ethan nodded, pulling out a small recorder. "If you're comfortable, Mr. Green, we'd like to record your statement. Everything you say will be kept in the strictest confidence until we're ready to move forward with our case." Thomas took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Sarah's. "I'll tell you everything," he said. It's high time someone stood up to the Hawthorns. For the next hour, Thomas painted a picture of life at the Hawthorne estate that left Sarah reeling. He spoke of Richard Hawthorne's numerous affairs, of Vivian's cruel treatment of the staff, of financial irregularities that hinted at something far more sinister than simple tax evasion. "But the worst of it," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is what happened to the last girl who caught Mr. Hawthorne's eye. A young maid named Lucy. She disappeared about a year ago. The official story was that she quit suddenly and moved back to her hometown. But I don't believe it for a second." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you think happened to her, Thomas?" The old groundskeeper shook his head, his eyes clouded with worry. "I don't know for sure, but I have my suspicions. The night before she vanished, I overheard an argument between Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne. They were shouting about Lucy, about how she was becoming a problem. The next day, she was gone, and we were all told not to mention her again." Ethan leaned forward, his legal mind working overtime. "Mr. Green, are you suggesting that the Hawthorns might have been involved in this girl's disappearance?" Thomas nodded solemnly. "I can't prove anything, but yes, that's exactly what I'm suggesting. And I'm not the only one who thinks so. There are whispers among the staff, rumors that the Hawthorns have done this before." Mr. Callahan's face had grown increasingly grim as Thomas spoke. "This is far more serious than we initially thought," he said, his voice low. "Ethan, I think we need to involve the authorities." Ethan nodded in agreement. "You're right, Dad. This goes beyond civil litigation. If what Mr. Green is saying is true, we could be looking at criminal charges." Sarah sat in stunned silence, trying to process what she had just heard. The Hawthorns, as cruel and arrogant as they were, had seemed merely unpleasant. But this was something far darker. As they left the cafe, Sarah's mind was reeling. She had come seeking justice for herself, but now she found herself at the center of what could be a much larger, more sinister story. "What do we do now?" she asked, looking between Mr. Callahan and Ethan. Ethan's jaw was set with determination. "Now, we gather more evidence. We need to find out what happened to Lucy and any other staff members who might have mysteriously quit. And we need to do it quickly, before the Hawthorns realize we're onto them." Mr. Callahan nodded in agreement. "I'll use my contacts to start digging into their financial records. If they've been covering up disappearances, there might be a money trail we can follow." As they drove back to the Callahan residence, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. But as she looked at the determined faces of her new allies, she felt a surge of courage. They would get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. Little did they know, events were already in motion that would bring the truth to light in ways none of them could have predicted. Back at the Hawthorne estate, Richard Hawthorne paced his study, a tumbler of scotch clutched in his trembling hand. The events of the past 24 hours had left him shaken to his core. Sarah's unjust dismissal, Vivian's cold cruelty, and the weight of years of secrets and lies were all pressing down on him, threatening to crush him. He took another swig of scotch, wincing as it burned its way down his throat. He had to make this right. He couldn't let another innocent young woman suffer because of his weakness and Vivian's jealousy. With a shaky hand, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he had sworn he would never use. It rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. Hawthorne? This better be important. Richard took a deep breath. Detective Reeves, I need to confess something. It's about Lucy Martinez. And others. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Detective Reeves spoke again, his voice was deadly serious. I'm listening, Hawthorne. And for your sake, I hope you're ready to tell me everything. As Richard began to speak, pouring out years of secrets and lies, he felt a strange mix of terror and relief. He knew his life as he knew it was over, but for the first time in years, he felt the crushing weight of guilt begin to lift. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of urgent voices downstairs. She quickly dressed and made her way to the Callahans' living room, where she found the family huddled around the television. The breaking news banner flashing across the screen made her heart skip a beat. Prominent businessman Richard Hawthorne arrested in connection with disappearance of former employee. As Sarah sank onto the couch, her eyes glued to the screen, the newscaster's voice filled the room. In a shocking turn of events, Richard Hawthorne, CEO of Hawthorne Industries and prominent figure in New York society, was arrested early this morning. Sources close to the investigation say Hawthorne turned himself in, confessing to involvement in the disappearance of Lucy Martinez, a former maid at the Hawthorne estate who vanished over a year ago. Police are currently searching the grounds of the estate, and there are unconfirmed reports that human remains have been found on the property. Vivian Hawthorne, Richard's wife, is also being questioned by authorities. Sarah felt as though the room was spinning. She had known the Hawthornes were cruel, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. Mr. Callahan muted the TV and turned to face them, his expression grim. This changes everything. Sarah, I know we were focused on clearing your name, but I think you've stumbled onto something much bigger here. Ethan nodded in agreement, his legal mind already racing. Dad's right. Sarah, you might be the key to unraveling this whole thing. You were the last person to work closely with the Hawthornes before everything fell apart. Your testimony could be crucial. Sarah felt a wave of fear wash over her. But I don't know anything about Lucy or any disappearances. I was only there for 6 months. Margaret reached out and squeezed Sarah's hand reassuringly. Sometimes, dear, it's not about what you know, but what you represent. You're living proof of the Hawthornes' cruelty and manipulation. Your story could encourage others to come forward. As the implications of what was happening began to sink in, Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear of what lay ahead, relief that the truth was finally coming to light, and a burning desire to see justice done not just for herself, but for Lucy and anyone else who had suffered at the Hawthornes' hands. She squared her shoulders and looked at the Callahans, her green eyes blazing with determination. Okay, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. What do we do next? Ethan leaned forward, his expression serious. First, we need to contact Detective Reeves. I know him from my work at the DA's office. He's a good man, thorough and fair. We'll tell him everything we know, everything Thomas told us yesterday. Mr. Callahan nodded in agreement. I'll reach out to my contacts in the media. We need to get ahead of this story, make sure Sarah's side is heard before the Hawthornes' lawyers can spin this into something else. As the Callahans sprang into action, Sarah felt as though she was watching a well-oiled machine at work. For the first time since this ordeal began, she felt truly hopeful. The truth was coming to light, and she was going to play a part in making sure justice was served. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of police interviews, depositions, and media appearances. Sarah found herself at the center of a storm that was rocking New York society to its core. As more details of the Hawthornes' crimes came to light, other former employees began to come forward with their own stories of abuse, manipulation, and cover-ups. The case was growing beyond anything anyone could have predicted. Through it all, the Callahans stood by Sarah's side, offering support, guidance, and protection from the media frenzy that surrounded her. Ethan worked tirelessly, coordinating with the DA's office to build an airtight case against the Hawthorns. One particularly grueling day, after hours of questioning by the police, Sarah found herself sitting in the Callahans' living room, emotionally and physically exhausted. Ethan sat down beside her, concern etched on his handsome features. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. Sarah managed a weak smile. "I'm okay. It's just overwhelming sometimes. I never imagined I'd be at the center of something like this." Ethan nodded understandingly. "You're doing incredibly well, Sarah. Your strength through all of this, it's inspiring." As their eyes met, Sarah felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the case. Over the past weeks, she and Ethan had grown close, bonding over late-night strategy sessions and shared moments of triumph and despair. She found herself drawn to his intelligence, his passion for justice, and his unwavering support. But before she could dwell on these feelings, Mr. Callahan burst into the room, his face alight with excitement. "We've got them," he exclaimed. The forensic accountants found a series of suspicious transfers linking the Hawthorns to offshore accounts. "It looks like they've been paying hush money to keep people quiet for years." This new evidence was the final nail in the Hawthorns' coffin. As the case against them grew stronger, their once loyal friends and business associates began to distance themselves, leaving the once mighty couple isolated and desperate. The day of the trial arrived, and Sarah found herself standing on the courthouse steps, surrounded by a sea of reporters and flashing cameras. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. As she walked into the courtroom, her eyes immediately fell on Richard and Vivian Hawthorn. The once proud couple looked pale and drawn, their designer clothes hanging loosely on their frames. Vivian's eyes blazed with fury as she caught sight of Sarah, but Richard couldn't seem to meet her gaze. The trial was long and grueling. Sarah listened as witness after witness came forward, each painting a picture of the Hawthorns' cruelty and corruption. She heard Thomas recount his suspicions about Lucy's disappearance, his voice breaking as he described the young maid's fear in her final days. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, she felt a moment of panic. But as she took the stand and looked out at the courtroom, she saw the Callahans sitting in the front row, their faces filled with encouragement and support. Ethan gave her a subtle nod, and she felt a surge of strength. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began to speak. She told her story clearly and confidently, detailing the night of the party, Vivian's cruel accusations, and the events that followed. As she spoke, she could feel the weight of the jury's attention, could see the shock and disgust on their faces as they realized the true nature of the Hawthorns. When the defense attorney tried to discredit her, suggesting she was nothing more than a disgruntled ex-employee looking for revenge, Sarah stood her ground. She spoke of her love for her job, her respect for the other staff members, and her genuine desire to simply do good work and support her family. As she stepped down from the witness stand, Sarah caught Ethan's eye. He was beaming at her, pride evident in every line of his face. In that moment, she knew that no matter what the outcome of the trial, she had done the right thing. The jury's deliberation was surprisingly short. When they filed back into the courtroom, the tension was palpable. As the foreman stood to read the verdict, Sarah held her breath. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendants, Richard and Vivian Hawthorn, guilty. On the charge of embezzlement, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of wrongful death in the case of Lucy Martinez, we find the defendant, Richard Hawthorn, guilty. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Sarah felt tears of relief and vindication streaming down her face. It was over. Justice had been served. As the Hawthorns were led away in handcuffs, Vivian's icy facade finally cracked. She turned to Sarah, her face contorted with rage. She shrieked. You ruined everything. You're nothing but a common maid. How dare you destroy us? But Sarah stood tall, unflinching in the face of Vivian's wrath. No, Mrs. Hawthorne, she said, her voice calm and clear. You destroyed yourselves. I just told the truth. With that, the Hawthorns were gone, their reign of terror finally at an end. In the aftermath of the trial, Sarah found herself thrust into the spotlight once again, but this time as a hero. News outlets clamored for interviews, praising her bravery and integrity. The story of the humble maid who had brought down one of New York's most powerful couples captivated the public imagination. But for Sarah, the greatest reward was knowing that justice had been served, not just for her, but for Lucy and all the others who had suffered at the Hawthorns' hands. As the media frenzy began to die down, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. Her life had been turned upside down, and she wasn't sure what the future held. But as she stood on the balcony of the Callahans' townhouse, looking out over the city, she felt a sense of peace and possibility. Soft footsteps behind her announced Ethan's presence. He joined her at the railing, his shoulder brushing against hers. Penny for your thoughts? He asked softly. Sarah smiled, turning to face him. I was just thinking about how much has changed. A few months ago, I was just a maid trying to make ends meet. Now I don't know what I am. Ethan's eyes softened as he looked at her. I know who you are, Sarah. You're one of the bravest, kindest, most principled people I've ever met. And if you'll let me, I'd like to help you figure out what comes next. As their eyes met, Sarah felt that now familiar flutter in her chest. Slowly, tentatively, Ethan leaned in, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to. But Sarah found herself leaning in too, her eyes fluttering closed as their lips met in a soft, sweet kiss. When they pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Sarah couldn't help but laugh. You know, she said, a mischievous glint in her eye, this is usually where the maid and the wealthy lawyer's son realize they're from different worlds and can never be together. Ethan chuckled, pulling her close. Good thing neither of us believes in clichés then, he murmured, before capturing her lips in another kiss. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms with the New York skyline as their backdrop, Sarah marveled at the twists and turns her life had taken. From a humble maid to the woman who had brought down an empire of corruption, she had faced humiliation, danger, and heartbreak. But she had also found strength she never knew she had, allies in unexpected places, and maybe, just maybe, a love that defied all odds. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, Sarah Thompson was excited to see what it held. She had learned that sometimes, the most extraordinary stories come from the most ordinary beginnings. And her story, she realized, was only just beginning. Epilogue. 5 years later, Sarah stood at the podium, her hands resting on the smooth wood as she looked out at the sea of eager faces before her. The auditorium of New York University was packed, students and faculty alike having turned out to hear her speak. When I was your age, she began, her voice clear and confident, I never imagined I'd be standing here today. I was a maid, working 2 jobs to support my family, dreaming of a better life but never quite believing it was possible. She paused, a small smile playing on her lips. But life has a funny way of surprising you. Sometimes, the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures if you have the courage to stand up for what's right. As she continued her speech, detailing her journey from maid to whistleblower to advocate for workers' rights, Sarah felt a swell of pride. The Sarah Thompson Foundation, which she had established with part of the settlement from her lawsuit against the Hawthorns, had already helped hundreds of domestic workers escape abusive situations and pursue education and better employment opportunities. Your background doesn't define you, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. Your choices do. Every one of you has the power to stand up for what's right, to make a difference in this world. It won't always be easy, but I promise you, it will always be worth it." As she concluded her speech to thunderous applause, Sarah's eyes found Ethan in the front row. He was beaming at her, pride evident in every line of his face. Beside him sat his parents, Alexander and Margaret Callahan, who had become like second parents to Sarah over the years. After the lecture, as Sarah was surrounded by students eager to speak with her, she felt a tug on her skirt. Looking down, she saw a little girl with curly brown hair and bright green eyes, a perfect blend of herself and Ethan. "Mommy, you were amazing," 4-year-old Lucy Callahan exclaimed, throwing her arms around Sarah's legs. Sarah scooped up her daughter, holding her close. "Thank you, sweetheart. Did you listen to the whole thing?" Lucy nodded solemnly. "Uh-huh. Daddy said you're a real-life superhero." Sarah laughed, looking over at Ethan who had joined them. "Did he now?" "Well, your daddy's pretty super himself." As they left the auditorium together, Sarah marveled at how far she had come. From a humble maid to a respected advocate and speaker, from alone in the world to surrounded by love and family. The journey hadn't been easy, but every hardship, every moment of doubt and fear, had led her here. The Hawthorns were a distant memory now. Richard was serving a life sentence, while Vivian, who had received a lighter sentence due to a plea deal, had faded into obscurity upon her release, shunned by the society she had once ruled. Sarah's story had inspired countless others to come forward, sparking a movement for better protection and rights for domestic workers across the country. The legislation she had helped push through, dubbed the Thompson Act, had set new standards for the treatment of household employees. As they walked out into the warm spring afternoon, Sarah felt a sense of contentment wash over her. Her life had taken a path she could never have imagined, but she wouldn't change a single step of the journey. "What now, my love?" Ethan asked, wrapping an arm around her waist as Lucy skipped ahead to walk with her grandparents. Sarah leaned into him, a smile playing on her lips. "Now? We keep going. There's still so much work to do, so many people who need help. But right now, in this moment, I think we deserve some ice cream with our daughter." Ethan laughed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Ice cream it is. Lead the way, Mrs. Callahan." As they walked down the street, hand in hand, with their daughter's laughter ringing in the air, Sarah knew that this moment, this life, was better than any fairy tale ending she could have dreamed of. The humble maid had not only survived humiliation and adversity, she had thrived, transforming her pain into purpose and her struggles into strength. Sarah Thompson Callahan had rewritten her own story, and in doing so, had changed the narrative for countless others. As the sun began to set over the New York skyline, casting a golden glow over the city, Sarah looked to the future with hope and determination. There would be new challenges to face, new battles to fight, but she was ready. For she had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that true power comes not from wealth or status, but from integrity, compassion, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And so, the story of the humble maid who shook the foundations of high society came to an end. But for Sarah, Ethan, little Lucy, and all those whose lives they would touch, it was really just the beginning.